As you saw in the previous video, we've gone through the installation process and we've gotten up to the instance configuration screen in the wizard. On this screen, we can select if we want to install a default instance or a named instance, and if a named instance, what we want to name that instance. We're going to go ahead and use a default instance, and we're going to leave the instance ID as what is in there as the default, MS SQL Server. If we used a named instance, we would select the named instance radio button, type in the name of the instance, and then the instance ID would change automatically. In almost no circumstances do we want the instance ID and the instance name to be different. Instance root directory is where the actual binary files are going to be installed. This doesn't mean this is where the databases are going to be installed. We're going to set that on a later screen. As we're going to leave everything as the default, we can just go ahead and click Next. If we had any instances already installed on the virtual machine, they would simply be displayed at the bottom so we can make sure that we don't have any naming conflicts. The next screen that we see is the disk space requirement screen. This is just simply giving us a basic summary of what we've done up to this point. We can see how much space we have available and how much space we're going to need on each drive that we're going to use to install the various components. The next screen that we see here is the screen with the service accounts. This is how we tell the installer what domain account or local account, or in this case service account, we're going to use to run our database engine under. By default, it's going to set the account name column to the ntservice/MSSQL server and ntservice/SQL Server agent service accounts. If we want to use a domain account, simply click into the field and you'll be prompted with a drop-down menu so you can browse and select the service account you want to use. We can search the domain and find the SQL service account that we've created using the SQL Server name. We would then jump into the password field and set the password for that specific account. In this case, let's go ahead and use the local service account. If you need to change the collation of the database, you can do so on the collation tab by clicking Customize and then selecting the collation that you want to use. On the service accounts, make sure that the services are set to automatic, manual, or disabled based on your needs. SQL Agent will always default to manual. You'll probably want to set it to automatic when doing the installation. If not, you can always change it after the fact in the Services control panel. We then click Next, and we're presented with the Database Engine Security Configuration screen. This is the screen that we select the authentication mode that we're going to be using for the instance by default, either Windows or mixed mode. If using Windows authentication mode, you'll want to make sure to specify SQL Server administrators. You'll have to add at least one user or group into this list to ensure that somebody has administrative rights into the instance when it comes online. By default, Windows Server 2012 is not going to give any local users or groups administrative rights, which is a change from prior versions. If using mixed mode, you select the mixed mode radio button, and then you'll need to enter in a password for the SA account. You'll need to put in at least some sort of password and making sure that password meets the security requirements of your local computer or Active Directory domain. I'm going to use Windows authentication mode for this example. I'm going to click the Add Current User button to add myself as a SQL Server administrator. If there was a domain group or other users I wanted to specify in there manually, I could click the Add button, and then I would be presented with a domain search field so that I could search all the users in the domain to find the users or groups that I wanted. On the Data Directories tab, we can specify a variety of directories that we want to use. The data root directory is going to be the default that we're going to want to change if we have multiple hard drives on our system. In my particular case, I do not. But maybe I don't like this long path that it's provided for me here. So in that case, what I can do is I can change this to something shorter. Putting your folders in a folder called MSSQL is a tried and true technique to putting the database files in an easy to find location without creating lots and lots of folders across the root of the hard drive for all your system files and all your user databases. You'll notice here that when I set the data root directory, all the other folders changed automatically for me. The system database directory changed to c:\mssql11.mssql server/mssql/data. So what this is, when I break it all down, is obviously the c:\mssql is what I typed in above. MS SQL 11 is the version that we're installing. Microsoft SQL Server 2012, which is the 11th version of the product. The MS SQL Server portion is the name of our instance. Remember, we're using the default instance, which means that it's actually named MS SQL Server. The next folder, MS SQL, just kind of goes along for the ride. That's always been there and pretty much always will be. All databases are put in a folder called Data by default. The only folder structure that has to be based on this standard is the system database directory. User databases, user logs, tempdb, and backups can all be saved in kind of whatever folder you want. Although personally, I do recommend keeping a similar folder structure as the default, as it's just easy to navigate that way, and it'll always be the same from server to server. Once we've got our data directory specified, we can then change the user database directory, user log directory, tempdb directory, tempdb log directory, and backup directory as needed. Now, this is new from previous versions of SQL Server where we did not get this many options. Previously, we simply got to select the folder that the user databases went into and the folder that the transaction logs would go into. Everything was simply put into those folders at that point. It's nice that we now have the tempdb folder so we don't have to move tempdb to another location, because in almost all circumstances, you're going to want tempdb created on its own physical hard drive. So there's no point in putting it in one place and then simply moving it to another later. Now we create it in its final location ahead of time and be done with it. Same goes for backups. We probably don't want them on the same drive as our system databases, so we can change the default backup location here as well. All of these settings can be changed later if needed from within Management Studio. If we're going to be using FileStream on our instance, we'll want to enable that here within the FileStream tab. If we don't, we're going to be able to configure that later on through the SQL Server Configuration Manager after the installation's been completed. We're going to go ahead and leave this disabled for right now as part of this demonstration. We then click Next. We're then given the option to send Windows and SQL Server error reports either to Microsoft or to your corporate reporting server. This setting only applies to services that are run without user interaction. In other words, just to the database engine services, not to Management Studio. It's up to your corporate policy as to whether or not you do this or not. If you do it, that's fantastic. Microsoft does look at any error message information that comes back to them. Typically, error messages are masked, and there is definitely no user data being sent back with the error message, only basic information. We click Next on this screen, and we get another rules configuration check. Again, the rules that you're going to see here are going to depend based on the services that you've got installed. With the services that I've selected to install, I've got the FAT32 file system check to make sure that we're not using FAT32. We're making sure that we're not in a Windows cluster. We're making sure we're not going to have any cross-language problems. And we're making sure that we're not attempting to install 64-bit on a 32-bit system or an IA64 on an X64 or vice versa. Honestly, I don't know why that check is there. Those installations would fail anyway, but the check is there to make sure that we're not doing that. Then go ahead and click Next. We're going to get a nice summary of what's going on. Now, this summary provides some very, very useful information. Specifically, this config file path that's shown at the bottom of the screen there. Your path is going to be different based on the date and time that you do the install. When this installation path comes up, what this config file can be used for is to automate future installs so that those future installs look exactly like this installation. What you would do is copy this configuration file.ini file off of this server onto a network share. On your new machines, you would simply launch the installer from the command line, similar to the way I'm going to show you in another demonstration as part of this lesson, launching the installation process, passing it to the path to this config file, and then simply the installation will proceed without any sort of manual intervention at all, and your settings will be exactly the same as they were set for this system. When we're ready to complete the installation, we go ahead and click Install. As the installation process goes through, which can take quite a long time to complete depending on which options you've selected, you'll see the bar at the top scroll across as the various pieces are completed. Once the installation is completed, you'll be greeted by a screen that looks hopefully very similar to this without any red X's on it. Red X's are bad, green check marks are good. In this case, our installation has completed successfully, and we now have all the components that we selected installed. We can review the information on the features that have been installed, as well as some additional useful information at the bottom. We also get a summary log, which has been saved into the Setup Bootstrap folder, which we can see located at the bottom there. We can review the information within that file at a later time to see if there's any useful information about any problems that may have come up, if any problems were reported. We click Close, back with the Installation Center, now with the links available. We can now install any service packs or hotfixes that we wish to install, as well as any other components that need to be installed. For the command line installer, the process is fairly simple, but it does require a little bit of research ahead of time to make sure that everything is set up the way you need it to, and make sure that you've got the appropriate command line switches for the components you wish to install. It does require this little bit of additional preparation, which can be a little annoying depending on how you're doing this. But if you're just going to set it up once and then use it over and over and over again through a batch file or through a configuration file, like we saw earlier, that's going to really make your life quite a bit easier. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the nice thing about the command line installer is it allows us to do the exact same installation over and over and over again, giving us what is an extremely repeatable process without having to make sure that we click the exact right settings. Please review the next video in this set to see the demonstration